history is full of confident lies. The guy who discovered America was 5 centuries late. The inventor of the light bulb was basically a marketing genius. And the so-called first computer? Ancient Greeks had one. These are 33 historical firsts that weren't actually first. And honestly, your school textbooks owe you an apology. 1. When you think vending machine, you probably picture some flickering box in a hospital hallway that eats your dollar and gives you nothing in return. But the very first vending machine wasn't dispensing stale chips. It was dispensing holy water. Around 2,000 years ago, a Greek engineer named Hero of Alexandria built a coin-operated device for Egyptian temples. You'd drop in a bronze coin, it would land on a small lever, the lever would tilt, and a measured amount of holy water would pour out. The whole thing was designed because temple-goers were apparently helping themselves to way too much free holy water, and the priests were fed up. So the first vending machine in history was essentially an anti-theft device for sacred liquid. The engineering was so clever that modern vending machines still use a version of the same basic lever and weight principle. Humanity has always been humanity. 2. Let's talk about Christopher Columbus discovering America. The man sailed across the Atlantic in 1492 and was immediately convinced he'd reached Asia. He called the local people Indians and went to his grave still believing he'd found a shortcut to the spice trade. Meanwhile, about 500 years earlier, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson actually set foot on North American soil, specifically Newfoundland, Canada. We know this because archaeologists found the remains of a Viking settlement at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with actual building foundations and iron rivets to prove it. So Columbus didn't discover America. He didn't even discover that he hadn't discovered it. And the Vikings didn't stick around either, which means the real discoverers were the indigenous people who'd been living there for thousands of years before any European showed up. 3. If you ever heard that Thomas Crapper invented the flush toilet, congratulations, you fell for one of history's greatest name-based coincidences. Crapper was a plumber, a very successful plumber who ran a thriving sanitary equipment company in London. But the actual flush toilet was invented back in 1592 by Sir John Harington, a godson of Queen Elizabeth I. He built it specifically for her, and he called it the Ajax, which was a cheeky pun on the Elizabethan slang for a toilet. Elizabeth apparently used it, but never had it widely installed, possibly because her court thought the whole thing was a ridiculous novelty. So the flush toilet existed for nearly 3 centuries before Crapper ever touched a pipe wrench. But one man got an entire slang word named after him, and the other just got a footnote. 4. Edward Jenner is known as the father of immunology for developing the smallpox vaccine in 1796, and he deserves credit for formalizing the science. But the core idea of fighting smallpox by deliberately exposing people to it? That was ancient. Chinese physicians as far back as the 10th century practiced something called variolation, where they'd take dried smallpox scabs, grind them into powder, and literally blow them up a patient's nose through a pipe. The left nostril for boys, the right for girls, because apparently even medieval immunology had a dress code. The practice also existed in parts of Africa and the Ottoman Empire long before it reached Europe, and it was actually introduced to England in the 1720s by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu after she observed it in Istanbul. Jenner refined it. He didn't dream it up from scratch. The idea had been circulating across continents for centuries before his famous cowpox experiment. 5. Thomas Edison and the light bulb. The classic American success story. Except Edison didn't invent the light bulb. Not even close. A British chemist named Warren de la Rue created a working vacuum bulb with a platinum filament all the way back in 1840. Another Englishman, Joseph Swan, developed a practical incandescent light with a carbon filament and was actually selling them in homes before Edison got his version to market. In fact, Swan's house in England was the first private residence in the world to be lit by a light bulb, a detail Edison fans tend to leave out. Edison's real genius was in making the bulb commercially viable and, more importantly, building an entire electrical grid to power it. He was less of a lone inventor and more of a systems engineer with a legendary talent for self-promotion. So next time someone says Edison invented the light bulb, just know that what he really invented was the brand. 6. People act like fast food was born in 1940s America with the McDonald brothers and their assembly line burgers. But 2,000 years earlier, ancient Romans were already living the drive-through lifestyle, minus the cars. They had thermopolia, which were literally street-side counters built into the walls of buildings with big clay pots set into the stone, filled with hot stews, lentils, cheap wine, and melted cheese. Pompeii alone had around 80 of these joints, and some of them even had dining areas in the back where you could sit down, making them more like full-service restaurants. Most Romans didn't even have kitchens in their homes because cooking indoors was a fire hazard in tightly packed apartment blocks. So grabbing lunch on the go wasn't some modern convenience. It was standard Roman urban life. They even had menus painted on the walls. No app required. 7. Most people associate submarines with World War I or maybe the Civil War ironclads. But the first working submarine was built in the 1620s by a Dutch inventor named Cornelis Drebbel, and it was powered by 12 rowers sitting inside a sealed wooden frame covered in greased leather. The thing actually worked. Drebbel tested it in the Thames River in London, and reportedly even took King James I on an underwater ride beneath the surface. That makes King James the first head of state to travel underwater, which is a hilariously specific historical achievement. The submarine could stay submerged for several hours and travel a few miles. Some accounts even suggest Drebbel figured out a way to chemically regenerate the air inside the vessel so the crew wouldn't suffocate. No torpedoes, no periscopes, just a bunch of guys rowing in the dark inside a greasy leather tube under the Thames. Peak 17th century engineering. 8. Ask anyone who the first president of the United States was, and they'll say George Washington without blinking. And technically, they're right. Washington was the first president under the Constitution, inaugurated in 1789. But before the Constitution existed, the country was governed under the Articles of Confederation, and that body had its own presiding officer. John Hanson was elected President of the United States in Congress assembled in 1781. His role was more like a chairman than a modern president, and he had almost no executive power, but the title was real, and he served a one-year term. There were actually several men who held this title before Washington ever took office. So Washington was the first president as we understand it today. But the phrase first president has a sneaky asterisk that most history classes conveniently ignore. 9. Walt Disney's Steamboat. Willie from 1928 is often called the birth of animation. Mickey Mouse whistling on a steamboat, audiences losing their minds. But animation existed long before Mickey learned to whistle. In 1908, a French artist named Émile Cohl created a film called Phantasmagorie, which is widely considered the first fully animated movie. It was a minute and a half of surreal, hand-drawn stick figures morphing into bizarre shapes, all done with about 700 individual drawings photographed onto paper. The style was dreamlike and slightly unhinged, like watching someone's fever dream on a chalkboard. And even before Cohl, there were earlier experiments with moving images, like Émile Reynaud's animated projections in Paris back in the 1890s. Disney turned animation into an empire. But Cohl was drawing frame by frame 20 years before Mickey Mouse was even a concept. The mouse gets the merch, but the Frenchman started the party. 10. Most people assume Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine invented the guillotine. He didn't. He was a physician who, in 1789, proposed to the French National Assembly that executions should be carried out by a quick, mechanical device to reduce suffering. The actual machine was designed by a German engineer named Tobias Schmidt, with input from a French surgeon named Antoine Louis, which is why it was briefly called the Louisette, before the catchier name stuck. And here's the real kicker. Head-chopping machines existed centuries before any of them were born. England had the Halifax gibbet, a heavy blade dropped from a wooden frame, documented as far back as 1280. Scotland had the Scottish maiden, which operated on the same basic principle and was used from the 1500s. So Guillotine didn't invent the device. He just lobbied for France to adopt a more humane version of something that had already been chopping heads across Europe for hundreds of years. 11. If someone says the first computer was ENIAC, built in 1945, they're skipping a lot of history. Way back in the 1830s, an English mathematician named Charles Babbage designed something called the analytical engine. It had a memory unit, a processing unit, and could be programmed using punched cards. It was, on paper, a general-purpose computer, a full century before ENIAC hummed to life. Ada Lovelace, a mathematician who worked with Babbage, even wrote what's considered the first computer algorithm for it, making her the world's first programmer before the machine was ever built. And if you want to go even further back, the ancient Greeks built the Antikythera mechanism around 100 BC, a hand-cranked device with dozens of interlocking bronze gears that could predict eclipses and track planetary movements. It was basically an astronomical calculator built 2,000 years before anyone invented the transistor. The future arrived early, it just didn't have electricity yet. 12. Everyone credits Italy with inventing pizza, and specifically the margherita pizza, supposedly created in 1889 for Queen Margherita of Italy. Great story. But flatbread with toppings? That concept is ancient. The Greeks were baking flat dough called plakos and topping it with olive oil, herbs, and cheese centuries before Rome was even a republic. Persian soldiers in the army of Darius the Great reportedly baked flatbread on their shields over open flames and covered it with cheese and dates during military campaigns. And the people of ancient Egypt were making flatbreads with various toppings long before anyone drew a map of Italy. Even in Pompeii, archaeologists found shops that looked suspiciously like ancient pizzerias, with flat stone counters and evidence of baked dough with toppings. So Italy perfected pizza, no argument there. But the basic idea of throwing stuff on flat dough and baking it? That's as old as civilization with an oven. 13. When you hear contact lenses, you probably think of some 20th century lab innovation. And the first practical ones were made in 1888 by a German ophthalmologist named Adolf Fick, who crafted heavy blown glass lenses that sat on the entire eyeball. Comfortable? Absolutely not. People could wear them for maybe a couple of hours before their eyes basically staged a revolt. But the idea itself goes back much further. In 1508, Leonardo da Vinci sketched a design showing how submerging the eye in a bowl of water could alter vision. He wasn't trying to invent contacts. He was just curious about optics, as Leonardo was curious about literally everything. Later, in 1636, René Descartes proposed placing a glass tube filled with liquid directly on the cornea. Neither concept was practical at the time, but the seed was planted centuries before Fick picked up his glass-blowing tools. 14. Ferdinand Magellan is celebrated as the first person to circumnavigate the globe. There's just one problem. He died halfway through the trip. In 1521, Magellan was killed in a battle on the island of Mactan in the Philippines after picking a fight with a local chieftain named Lapu-Lapu, who wasn't remotely interested in being colonized. The expedition continued without him, and it was Juan Sebastian Elcano who actually captained the remaining ship back to Spain in 1522. But there's an even more overlooked figure, Enrique of Malacca, an enslaved man Magellan had brought from Southeast Asia years earlier. Because Enrique had originally traveled west from Malacca to Europe with Magellan, and then sailed east with the expedition back toward Asia, some historians argue he technically completed a full loop around the planet before anyone else. So the first person to circle the Earth may not have been a captain or an explorer, but an enslaved translator whose name most people have never heard. 15. Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone in 1876 and became one of the most famous inventors in history. But there's a man who should be just as famous and isn't. Antonio Meucci was an Italian immigrant living on Staten Island who developed a working voice communication device he called the teletrafono as early as the 1850s. He even set up a communication link in his own home so he could talk to his bedridden wife from his workshop. The problem? Meucci was broke. He couldn't afford the full patent fee, So he filed a cheaper temporary notice called a caveat, which he had to renew every year. When he couldn't pay the $10 renewal fee, it lapsed, and his working models were reportedly lost by a Western Union laboratory where they had been stored. Shortly after, Bell, who conducted experiments in that very same lab, got the patent. In 2002, the United States House of Representatives officially recognized Mucci's work in the invention of the telephone. Justice, about 130 years too late. 16. Modern anesthesia is usually traced to 1846, when an American dentist named William Morton publicly demonstrated the use of ether to knock a patient out during surgery in Boston. It was a landmark moment in the history of medicine. But roughly 1,600 years earlier, a Chinese physician named Hua Tuo was already putting patients under for major operations. He used a concoction called mafizan, which translates roughly to cannabis boil powder, a drink made from a blend of herbal ingredients dissolved in wine. According to ancient Chinese records, Hua Tuo performed abdominal surgeries using this anesthetic during the 2nd century, including operations that would be considered major, even by modern standards. The exact recipe has been lost to time, which is probably for the best, considering what people might do with it. But the point stands. General anesthesia was being used in China over a millennium before the West had its big ether moment. 17. James Watt is the name everyone associates with the steam engine, and his face might as well be stamped on every piston ever made. But Watt didn't invent the steam engine. He improved it. The first practical steam engine was built by Thomas Newcomen in 1712, and it was used to pump water out of flooded coal mines in England. Watt's contribution was making it significantly more efficient by adding a separate condenser, which is huge, but it's still an upgrade, not an invention. And if you want to go way further back, our old friend Hero of Alexandria, the same guy who built the vending machine, created a device called the Eolipoli around the 1st century. It was a hollow sphere mounted on a pipe that spun when steam escaped through 2 nozzles. It didn't do any useful work, but it proved the principle. The steam engine wasn't born in the Industrial Revolution. It was born in an ancient Greek workshop as a party trick. 18. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859 and became synonymous with evolution. It's one of the most important scientific works ever written. But roughly 1,000 years earlier, a 9th century Islamic scholar named Al-Jahiz wrote a massive work called Kitab al-Hayawan, or the Book of Animals, in which he described how environmental factors force animals to adapt, compete for resources, and change over generations. He wrote about the struggle for survival, how animals develop traits that help them find food and avoid predators, and how species transform as a result. His work ran to 7 volumes and covered everything from animal behavior to the food chain, making it one of the most ambitious works of natural history in the medieval world. It's not identical to Darwin's theory, and it lacked the rigorous data Darwin compiled. But the core observation, that living things change in response to their environment, was on paper in Baghdad, centuries before Darwin boarded the Beagle. 19. When Europeans started using paper money in the 17th century, it felt like a revolutionary leap from hauling around bags of metal coins. But China had already been there, done that, and moved on. During the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century, Chinese merchants began using certificates of deposit called fiqian, which literally translates to flying cash, because the notes were so light they could blow away in the wind. By the Song Dynasty, the government formalized this into actual printed paper currency, complete with anti-counterfeiting measures like special ink and intricate designs. Marco Polo, when he visited China in the 13th century, was absolutely stunned that an entire empire ran on paper money. He wrote about it in detail, and Europeans basically didn't believe him. So while Europe was still melting down silver and stamping coins, China was printing money like it was no big deal, roughly 8 centuries ahead of the curve. 20. Hammurabi's Code, carved around 1750 BC, is the law code everyone learns about in school. An eye for an eye and all that. Dramatic, memorable, and often presented as the first written set of laws in history, except it wasn't. The Code of Ur-Nammu from the Sumerian city of Ur predates Hammurabi's laws by about 300 years, making it the oldest surviving law code we've found so far. And here's what's fascinating. While Hammurabi's code is famously brutal, Ur-Nammu's approach was surprisingly chill by comparison. Instead of chopping off hands and gouging out eyes, it mostly prescribed monetary fines. Broke someone's bone? Pay them a mina of silver. Knocked out a tooth? That'll be 2 shekels. It reads less like an ancient punishment list and more like a really aggressive insurance policy. So the oldest known law code in the world was actually more reasonable than the famous one that came after it. 21. Henry Ford did not invent the car. Let's just get that out of the way. Ford invented the assembly line for mass-producing cars, which is impressive in its own right, but the automobile itself has a longer and weirder history. Carl Benz built and patented the first gasoline-powered car in 1886, the Benz Patent Motor Wagon, a 3-wheeled contraption that looked like a tricycle having an identity crisis. But even Benz wasn't technically first. In 1769, a French engineer named Nicolas Joseph Cugnot built a steam-powered 3-wheeled vehicle designed to haul artillery for the French army. It weighed about 4,000 kilograms, had a top speed of roughly 3 kilometers per hour, and reportedly crashed into a wall during one of its first test runs. The original vehicle still survives and is on display at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris. So the first car accident might have happened before the car was even officially a thing. 22. If someone says world map, you probably picture the Mercator projection, that rectangular map hanging in every classroom, created by Gerardus Mercator in 1569. But humans were mapping the known world long before that. Around 600 BC, Babylonian scholars carved what's known as the Imago Mundi onto a small clay tablet barely the size of a human hand. It showed Babylon at the center, naturally, surrounded by a ring of water called the Bitter River, with triangular regions beyond it representing distant, almost mythical lands. It wasn't geographically accurate by any stretch. It was more like a cosmological diagram with a massive ego. But it was a deliberate attempt to represent the entire world on a flat surface, and it's the oldest known map to try doing that. So cartography didn't start with European explorers. It started with a Babylonian who thought his city was the center of the universe. 23. Wilhelm Röntgen is officially credited with discovering X-rays in 1895, and even won the very first Nobel Prize in Physics for it. But there's a lesser-known figure who was working with the same phenomenon before Röntgen made headlines. Ivan Puliuy, a Ukrainian physicist, had developed a device known as the Puliuy lamp as early as the 1880s, and he used it to generate what we now recognize as X-rays. He even produced images of bones, including a famous photograph of his daughter's hand skeleton. Puliuy published his findings in scientific papers, but they didn't get the attention they deserved, partly because they were written in a less widely read language, and partly because the scientific community wasn't yet ready to understand what he had. Röntgen himself was a meticulous scientist who immediately understood the significance of what he found, which is a big part of why his discovery took off. Röntgen got the spotlight, the Nobel, and the name. Puliuy got a footnote and a long overdue Wikipedia page. 24. Ancient Athens is almost universally taught as the birthplace of democracy, and there's good reason for that. The Athenian system, established around 508 BC, was genuinely groundbreaking. But there's a strong case that democratic governance existed elsewhere at the same time or even earlier. The ancient Indian Republic of Vaishali, located in what is now Bihar, is believed to have had a form of representative assembly possibly as early as the 6th century BC. Elected representatives gathered to make decisions on behalf of the people, which sounds a lot like a republic to most ears. There were also other Gana Sanghas, or tribal republics, across the Indian subcontinent operating on similar principles. It's worth noting that Athens' version of democracy also had massive blind spots, since women, enslaved people, and foreigners were all completely excluded from participation. Athens deserves its legendary status, but the idea of people governing themselves wasn't exclusive to the Mediterranean. It was sprouting up independently on the other side of the world. 25. Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press around 1440 and changed the course of Western civilization. That part is true. But he didn't invent movable type. About 400 years before Gutenberg was even born, a Chinese commoner named Bi Sheng invented movable type printing around 1040 using individual characters carved from a baked clay. You'd arrange the characters on a frame, ink them, press paper against them, and you had a printed page. Bi Sheng's system worked, but because the Chinese writing system has thousands of characters, it was far less practical than Gutenberg's Latin alphabet version, with just a couple dozen letters. Korea also developed metal movable type before Gutenberg, printing a Buddhist text called the Jikji in 1377, which still survives and is recognized by UNESCO as the oldest known book printed with metal movable type. So Gutenberg's press was revolutionary for Europe, absolutely. But the underlying idea had already been invented, tested, and refined in Asia centuries earlier. 26. Isaac Newton and the falling apple. It's one of the most famous stories in science. Whether the apple actually bonked him on the head is debatable, but Newton did publish his law of universal gravitation in 1687. However, roughly 1,000 years before Newton was born, an Indian mathematician and astronomer named Brahmagupta was already describing gravity as an attractive force. In his 7th century work, he used the Sanskrit term Gurutvakarshan, meaning attracted by gravity, and he stated that objects fall to the earth because it is in the nature of the earth to attract things. He didn't have the math Newton eventually developed, and he couldn't describe the inverse square law, but the fundamental observation that the earth pulls objects toward itself was articulated in India over a millennium before that apple supposedly fell in an English garden. Newton gave gravity the math, but Brahmagupta gave it the words. 27. The compass is often associated with European exploration and the Age of Discovery, as if sailors just woke up one day in the 1400s and invented navigation. But the compass was invented in China during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BC. And here's the funny part. They didn't use it for navigation at first. They used it for feng shui. The earliest Chinese compasses were made of lodestone, a naturally magnetic mineral, shaped into a spoon that would spin on a flat bronze plate and always point south. They were used to align buildings, tombs, and spiritual spaces with the Earth's magnetic field. It wasn't until several centuries later that someone thought, hey, maybe this thing that always points the same direction could help us not get lost at sea. By the time European explorers were using compasses to cross oceans, China had been using them for over 1,000 years, just mostly to arrange furniture and burial plots. 28. Benjamin Franklin is often credited with founding the first public library in America in 1731, and that's a fair claim for the American context. But the concept of a large, organized collection of knowledge open to readers is ancient. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled from around 668 BC, built a massive library in the city of Nineveh containing over 30,000 clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform text. The collection covered everything from astronomy and medicine to mythology and legal codes, including a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest pieces of literature in human history. Ashurbanipal wasn't just a conqueror. He was genuinely obsessed with knowledge and personally ordered the collection and copying of texts from across his empire. The library was meticulously organized and cataloged. When it was discovered by archaeologists in the 1850s, it gave the modern world some of its earliest records of Mesopotamian civilization. Franklin had a lending library. Ashurbanipal had an entire knowledge empire etched in clay. 29. Nicholas Copernicus published his heliocentric model in 1543, arguing that the Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around. It was a seismic shift in how humans understood the cosmos, and it kicked off the scientific revolution. But about 18 centuries earlier, a Greek astronomer named Aristarchus of Samos proposed essentially the same thing. Around 270 BC, Aristarchus argued that the sun was at the center and the Earth orbited around it. He even attempted to calculate the relative sizes and distances of the sun and moon, and while his numbers were off, his methods were genuinely scientific. His contemporaries mostly ignored him because the idea seemed absurd. If the Earth were moving, they reasoned, wouldn't we feel it? Aristotle's Earth-centered model was more intuitive and way more popular, so it won for roughly 2,000 years. Aristarchus was right, and nobody cared. If that isn't the most relatable thing in all of science history, I don't know what is. 30. The Wright brothers made their famous powered flight at Kitty Hawk in December 1903, and they're rightly considered pioneers of aviation. But the story of human flight didn't start on that beach. A German-born inventor named Gustav Whitehead claimed to have flown a powered, bat-wing-shaped airplane in Connecticut in August 1901, more than 2 years earlier. Whether his flight actually happened is still hotly debated among aviation historians, and the evidence is largely based on newspaper reports and witness accounts rather than photographic proof. But if you want a truly early attempt, look to 9th century Spain. Abbas ibn Firnas, a scholar in Muslim Cordoba, built a glider made of silk and wood, launched himself from a height, and reportedly stayed airborne for a significant stretch before crash landing and injuring his back. He forgot to add a tail for a controlled landing. 1,000 years before Kitty Hawk, a man in a silk glider was already learning the hard way that flying is easier than stopping. 31. We call them Arabic numerals, but the number system we use today, including the concept of zero, actually originated in India. The ancient Indian mathematician Brahmagupta, working in the 7th century, was the first to formally define zero as a number and lay out rules for how to use it in mathematics. He described operations like adding zero, subtracting zero, and even attempted to define dividing by zero, which mathematicians still argue about today. The concept then traveled to the Arab world through trade and scholarship, and Arab mathematicians like al-Khwarizmi popularized it further, which is why the West ended up calling them Arabic numerals, even though India started the whole thing. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the Maya civilization in Central America had independently developed their own concept of zero as a placeholder centuries earlier. So zero was invented at least twice on 2 different continents by people who had no idea the other existed. Not bad for nothing. 32. Guglielmo Marconi won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909 for his contributions to radio, and he's generally known as the father of radio communication. But Nikola Tesla had filed patents for radio technology in the United States years before Marconi's famous transatlantic transmission in 1901. Tesla demonstrated radio-controlled devices publicly in 1898 at Madison Square Garden, steering a small boat by remote control in front of a stunned audience who thought it was magic. His patents described the fundamental principles of radio transmission. Marconi's early patents were actually rejected because they overlapped too closely with Tesla's work. In 1943, the United States Supreme Court posthumously restored Tesla's radio patents, effectively acknowledging that Tesla's work predated Marconi's. But by then, Marconi had already collected the Nobel, the fame, and the legacy. Tesla, as usual, got the recognition decades too late and the consolation prize of being an internet meme a century after his death. 33. John Dalton is often credited as the father of modern atomic theory for his work in the early 1800s, and his model of the atom laid the foundation for modern chemistry. But the idea that all matter is made up of tiny, indivisible particles is thousands of years old. Around the 5th century BC, the Greek philosopher Democritus proposed that if you kept cutting matter into smaller and smaller pieces, you'd eventually reach something that couldn't be cut any further. He called these particles atomos, meaning uncuttable, and he believed they were eternal, infinite in number, and constantly in motion. Around the same time, or possibly even earlier, the Indian philosopher Canada developed a remarkably similar theory, describing the smallest unit of matter as anu, and proposing that these particles combine in different ways to form everything we see. 2 thinkers, on opposite sides of the ancient world, independently arrived at the same mind-blowing conclusion. Dalton gave it scientific rigor, but the idea itself? It's older than most civilizations. That's 33 stolen firsts, forgotten geniuses, and history books that need a serious rewrite. Now I want to settle something in the comments. Name one famous historical figure you think gets way too much credit for something they didn't actually do. I already have a few in mind, but I want to see who you call out first. Most liked comment gets pinned. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if your trust in textbooks just took a hit, and I'll see you soon.